Sea Route to the Spice Lands by Cynthia Clampett. When spices ruled the world, as soon as people had enough food to eat, the next thing they wanted was for the food to taste good. This was as true 4,000 years ago as it is today. 4,000 years ago, spices were already an important part of international commerce. Most of the world's favorite spices originated in southern India, Sri Lanka, and the Moluccas, or Spice Islands of Indonesia, and they were being traded as far away as the Middle East by 2600 BC. Flavoring foods was not the only use for spices. The Egyptians used cinnamon and cassia for embalming mummies, while Israelites used them to make fragrant ceremonial oil. Cassia is a tree with bark that tastes like cinnamon, though it is stronger. Almost everyone used spices as medicine, and today we are learning that many spices do have medicinal properties. Black pepper, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, and cassia were the most important spices of early commerce. They were carried throughout Asia and Arabia, and they finally reached the Mediterranean region by the 400s BC. The Romans consumed spices in staggering quantities. In fact, ancient Rome had an entire market just for black pepper. Ginger sold so well that the sales tax on it provided a major portion of the income needed to support Rome's government. While all the spices were popular and heavily traded, pepper was definitely king. When Alaric the Visigoth held Rome for ransom in AD 408, his demands included 3,000 pounds of black pepper. By the Middle Ages, a serf in France could buy freedom for 1 pound of pepper. Wealth was soon expressed in terms of how much pepper a person had. Before the Romans found a way to sail to India, around AD 40, the Arabs had controlled the spice trade. Arab traders had spread stories that spices were guarded by winged beasts and poisonous snakes to try to keep away competition. The Romans did not believe the tales, however, and once they discovered that the monsoon winds could carry them to India swiftly, consumption of spices increased dramatically. When Rome declined, North Africa's Arab traders controlled the spice trade again. Merchants from Venice enjoyed a monopoly on the spices coming through Alexandria during most of the Middle Ages. With Europe consuming an average of 6.6 million pounds of pepper annually, Venice became fabulously wealthy. Too wealthy, in fact, not to create jealousy and competition. Muslim influence in the Mediterranean. From the time of Muhammad, Muslims began spreading their religion and culture throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Islam was spread through trade, which is how it reached India and Indonesia, and through war, which is how it reached Mediterranean lands. During the late 600s, Arabs swept across North Africa, conquering the outposts of the Byzantine Empire. In the spring of 711, Muslims from North Africa invaded Spain. The cities of the coast fell under their control quickly, and the Muslim armies marched north, reaching Toledo by winter. By 714, most of Spain and Portugal were under Muslim control. The Muslims who occupied Spain and Portugal came to be called Moors. The Muslim conquerors were more advanced than the Visigoths, who had controlled much of Spain before the Moors arrived. Some people benefited by the Moorish presence. Serfs who converted to Islam could gain their freedom. Taxes were often lower under the Moors' rule than they had been under the Visigoths. In addition, Muslim culture brought Europeans into contact with sciences and arts that Muslim scholars had collected from ancient Greece and India or discovered themselves. Knowledge of architecture, map-making, mathematics, and astronomy spread due to Muslim influence. Another Muslim group, the Ottoman Turks, was a threat to the Byzantine Empire throughout the 1200s and 1300s. The Turks conquered Asia Minor and then entered Europe in the mid-1300s, sweeping through the Balkan countries and capturing Macedonia. In 1422, the Ottoman Turks laid siege to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This attempt failed, but another attempt in 1453 was successful. The fall of Constantinople sent a shockwave through Europe. Not only was this city the capital of a powerful empire, It was also the center for trade with Asia. The spice trade was cut off. In 1492, after 700 years of occupation, Spain finally succeeded in driving out the Moors. After centuries of fighting, the Spanish government could focus its attention and spend its money on something besides war. Finding a new way to India seemed like a good idea. The first country to do it would become immensely rich. The distance barrier. Europeans knew the earth was round long before Columbus's time. In fact, the ancient Greeks calculated the planet's circumference, or distance around a circle, fairly accurately. The obstacle that kept Europeans from sailing west was that they knew how far around Earth was, 25,000 miles, but they did not know how far west they would have to sail to reach Asia. Ships were small, and it was impossible to carry food and water to last for more than a few months. There needed to be places to stop for supplies. No one knew that there was land between Europe and Asia. Another big problem was that it was difficult to determine a ship's position when it sailed too far from Europe. Stars were used to navigate, but if a ship sailed too far south, the stars were different. People knew about latitude, but no one had been able to calculate longitude accurately. A clock that could work on a boat and be accurate for a long period of time was needed to calculate longitude accurately, but it would be more than 200 years before such a clock was invented. As a result, it was impossible to estimate how far a ship heading west had sailed. The only instruments available to sailors were the magnetic compass to show direction, and the astrolabe, an ancient instrument that used the stars to help determine position. Maps were also important to navigation, the science of charting a ship's course and position. But maps helped only while you were near land. What would finally make Europeans willing to attempt sailing to Asia? We can cross the ocean. There had long been rumors of land that could be reached across the ocean. Basque fishermen who followed the codfish in the North Atlantic sometimes told tales of seeing land. Few people believed these rumors and tales, but one man took them seriously. Christopher Columbus was certain these stories were true, and he was certain the land was Asia. Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy in 1451, though the exact date of his birth is uncertain. He learned sailing and navigation in the Portuguese merchant marine, and as an independent agent for a number of trading firms. By 1485, he had sailed as far north as Iceland, and as far south as West Africa, improving his skills and learning the Atlantic wind systems, knowledge that would help him later. As his dream of reaching Asia grew, Columbus sought support from the King of Portugal, but the king refused to help him. By 1486, Columbus had moved to Spain, where he tried to interest King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in his project. Influenced by the writings of Marco Polo and other geographers of the day, Columbus was convinced that Asia was close enough to reach by sailing west. In calculating the distance he would have to sail, he also made a mathematical error that placed Asia thousands of miles closer to Europe than it actually was. Columbus was rejected twice. Columbus was at the siege of Granada, the last Moorish stronghold in Spain, when it surrendered in January 1492. On his way home, he received a message from the king and queen. Overjoyed by the recent victory, they were now prepared to help with Columbus's planned journey. A court official helped Columbus raise money for the trip, though Columbus also poured his own savings into the venture. On August 3, 1492, the hopeful explorer, now bearing the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea, departed from Spain. Columbus's navigational skill was shown early and often. Rather than sailing straight west, he sailed south to Africa, where he could take advantage of winds that blew in a westward direction. Even with the favorable wind, it took 2 months to cross the Atlantic Ocean. His crew became fearful, but on October 12, 1492, land was sighted. Columbus and his crew sailed among the islands, which they thought were the East Indies, giving them Spanish names while looking for China and Japan. Having found gold in Haiti, which he named Hispaniola, Columbus hoped that this was one of the fabled islands of riches. With the help of the Taino inhabitants, he built a fort and left part of his crew behind. Then, having gathered gold, parrots, spices, new foods, and a few captives, he sailed back to Spain. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were impressed with what Columbus brought them, but they still wanted him to locate India. Columbus made 3 more voyages, exploring farther each time. However, although he was a brilliant navigator, he was a terrible governor, and settlements he tried to establish failed. Focused on his goals and desperate to prove he was right, he misjudged people and mishandled situations, which made him many enemies. He died far less famous than he had hoped, and still believed he had reached Asia. But while the world now ignored him, many recognized the importance of what he had done. He had opened a path across the sea. Soon, other ships were sailing across the Atlantic. Sailing around Africa. Since the time of the Romans, Europeans had known that if you could get to the east side of Africa, the monsoon winds could carry you to India. For centuries this had been accomplished by crossing Egypt to the Red Sea, building ships, and then sailing across the Indian Ocean. After the Muslim conquest of the region, however, this land route was closed. Europeans began to wonder if there was another way to get to Africa's east side. In 1488, Portuguese navigator and explorer Bartolomeu Dias made a discovery that answered this question. He had been sent south to determine if it was possible to sail around Africa. No one knew where Africa ended, or if it continued all the way to the South Pole. Dias spent more than a year following the African coast, and in February 1488 he sailed past the end of Africa, turned east, and discovered that his path was no longer blocked by land. Dias had discovered a sea route to the Spice Islands. As he returned home, Dias saw a high rocky point of land that marked the southern limit of Africa. He named it the Cape of Good Hope, because it offered the hope of reaching India. The King of Portugal did not act on this discovery for another 9 years. He was waiting for a second explorer, who had traveled to India by an overland route, to come back with information about the conditions there. When the news reached the king that Columbus had successfully crossed the Atlantic Ocean, for Portugal's rival Spain, he decided it was time for Portugal to attempt another voyage to the east. But he did not ask Dias to sail to India. That honor went instead to Vasco da Gama, the son of a Portuguese nobleman. Little is known of da Gama's early life, except that he was born in 1460 and studied mathematics and navigation. When the King of Portugal decided in 1495 that it was time to send a fleet to India, he chose Estefão da Gama, Vasco da Gama's father, to lead the expedition. When Estefão died, his son took his place. Vasco da Gama left Portugal on July 8, 1497. Sailing south, da Gama did not reach the Cape of Good Hope until November 22nd. By March of the following year, he had reached Mozambique, an independent city-state ruled by Muslims and enriched by trade with the Arabs. There, he offended the Sultan by offering him trinkets instead of the fine items the Sultan was expecting to receive as a gesture of goodwill. In April 1498, da Gama's expedition reached Kenya. There da Gama found a sailor who knew the way to India. It took 23 days to cross the Indian Ocean, and on May 20th, da Gama reached Calicut, one of the great trading ports of southern India. Da Gama returned home, with great difficulty but in triumph, and reached Portugal in September 1499. The King of Portugal immediately sent out a fleet of 13 ships, under the command of Pedro Alvares Cabral. Cabral reached India, but the people he left behind were killed. In 1502, da Gama was given command of the fleet that was sent to get revenge. The Portuguese had better weapons than the Indians and Arabs they faced, and soon Portugal had taken possession of most of southern India's spice trade ports. With control of the world's spice trade, Portugal was suddenly a world power. Da Gama returned to Portugal, but in 1524 the king named him Viceroy of India, where he died in 1538. Dividing up the world. Portugal and Spain had long been rivals. After Columbus's first voyage, the two countries agreed to divide the world. An imaginary line, called the Line of Demarcation, was drawn from north to south, running from Greenland down through Brazil. According to the agreement, control of everything west of the line was given to Spain, and everything east of the line was given to Portugal. Portugal had taken control of much of the African coast and southern India, and by 1512 had even reached the Moluccas, the Spice Islands of Indonesia. However, the Moluccas were so far east that the King of Spain wondered if they could be considered part of his lands west of the line of demarcation. Ferdinand Magellan offered to find out the answer. Magellan was born in Portugal in 1480. Between 1505 and 1512, he had sailed with the Portuguese navy and took part in battles in Africa and India. In 1513, he was sent to Morocco to battle the Moors. Magellan received a wound that left him with a limp for the rest of his life. When he returned to Portugal, he asked the king for a small raise in pay, but the king refused and said that Magellan should consider working for someone else. Magellan renounced his Portuguese citizenship and offered his services to the King of Spain. Magellan suggested that the Moluccas could be reached by sailing west, rather than around Portuguese-controlled Africa. The king approved of the plan, and on September 20, 1519, Magellan left Spain in command of 5 ships. Magellan encountered storms as he crossed the Atlantic to Brazil, but he reached Rio de Janeiro safely by December 13th. He hoped to find a passage through South America, so he explored numerous inlets and bays as he sailed south. Storms were not Magellan's only problem. Some of the Spanish captains resented having a Portuguese commander, and in March 1520 there was a serious mutiny. Magellan was able to stop the mutiny by executing one of the mutiny's leaders. Continuing south, Magellan found a strait, or a narrow channel that connects 2 bodies of water, on October 21st. This was the hoped-for passage, and Magellan sailed through to the Pacific. The Pacific crossing was calm, but long, and the crews were sick and starving by the time they reached Guam in March 1521. They stayed long enough to regain their health, then loaded the ships with coconuts and sailed on. Magellan sailed next to the islands later known as the Philippines. He made an alliance with the people of one island, but on April 27th people on another one of the islands killed Magellan. From the Philippines, Magellan's 2 surviving ships continued sailing west to the Moluccas, but only one reached Spain in 1522. This was the first circumnavigation of the world. Though Magellan did not return with the ship, the achievement was still considered his. It had been his plan, and he was the commander who had guided the expedition around South America and across the Pacific Ocean. The passage he discovered was named the Strait of Magellan in his honor.